Right now, there are roughly 8 billion human beings alive on this planet, and every single one of them belongs to the same species. One kind of human. It feels so ordinary that it barely registers as a fact. Of course, there is only one kind of human. What else would there be? But that is not the normal condition of our world. It is the strangest thing about the present moment, and it is very recent. For most of the time our species has existed, the Earth had several kinds of human on it at once, not ancestors, contemporaries, other people walking around, lighting fires, raising children, burying their dead, occupying the same valleys and the same coastlines and the same caves. Neanderthals in the West, Homo floresiensis on an island in Indonesia, Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, and somewhere across the vast eastern half of Asia, a population so completely unknown to us that for 200 years of scientific excavation, nobody suspected they had ever existed. We found them by accident, in 2008. Not from a skull, not from a skeleton, not from a burial site, from a fragment of finger bone about the size of a grain of rice, sitting in a bag of unremarkable material dug out of a Siberian cave floor. That fragment turned out to be a species. And that species is not entirely gone. Its DNA is still running, right now, in the bodies of hundreds of millions of living people, including, in one specific and remarkable case, keeping human beings alive at altitudes that should not be survivable. This is the story of the Denisovans, and it is arguably the most important thing archaeology has discovered this century. It begins in the Altai Mountains in southern Siberia, in a limestone cave called Denisova. The cave takes its name from a hermit, Denis, who is said to have lived in it in the 18th century, which is a small piece of irony, because for tens of thousands of years that cave was one of the most crowded pieces of real estate in the ancient world. In the summer of 2008, Russian excavators working through the cave's layers recovered a tiny piece of bone, the tip of a finger, from a young girl, somewhere between roughly 50 and 75,000 years old. There was nothing to see in it, no diagnostic shape, no distinguishing anatomy. Under the older rules of paleoanthropology, that fragment was effectively worthless. You cannot classify a human being from a fingertip. But by 2008, the rules had changed. The fragment was sent to a laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, run by a Swedish geneticist named Svante Pääbo, a man who had spent his entire career doing something most of his field considered a waste of time, trying to pull intact DNA out of bones that had been sitting in the ground since the Ice Age. He would eventually win a Nobel Prize for it. His team extracted the genetic material and sequenced it, expecting one of two answers. Either the girl was a Neanderthal, the cave was in Neanderthal territory, or she was an early modern human. She was neither. Her mitochondrial DNA sat at a distance from ours that made no sense. Neanderthal DNA differs from modern human DNA by a certain measurable margin. This sequence differed by close to twice that. It was not a variant of anything known. It was a separate lineage, deep and old and entirely undocumented, and the people who found it had no fossils, no tools they could confidently attribute, no anatomy, no geographic range, and no name for it. Stop and consider how backwards this is. Every other human species in the record was discovered the same way. Someone finds bones, the bones look strange, scientists argue about what they are, and eventually a species gets defined by its anatomy. The Denisovans arrived in the opposite direction. We had the genome before we had the face. We knew this population's ancestry, their relationship to us, and eventually their interbreeding history, while still having no idea what a single one of them looked like. They were named after the cave because there was nothing else to name them after. What the genome said, once the full nuclear sequence came back, reorganized the human family tree. The lineage that produced Neanderthals and Denisovans split away from the lineage that produced us somewhere in the region of 600,000 years ago. Then, roughly 400,000 years ago, that lineage split again, into two. One branch moved west and became the Neanderthals of Europe and the Near East. The other branch went east, and there they stayed, for hundreds of thousands of years, across a landmass so enormous that we are still finding the edges of it, while we, on the other side of the world, had no idea they had ever been there at all. Then came the discovery that changed the emotional register of the whole story. In 2018, the Leipzig lab sequenced another fragment from the same cave, a splinter of long bone around 90,000 years old, belonging to a girl who was at least 13 when she died. Researchers nicknamed her Denny. Her genome showed something nobody had ever seen in an ancient human sample. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan, not a distant ancestor from one group and a distant ancestor from the other. First generation. Her parents were two different kinds of human, and she was the direct result. The improbability here is worth sitting with. The total number of archaic human genomes ever sequenced to a useful standard is small, a few dozen, and one of them, pulled essentially at random out of a cave floor, is a first-generation hybrid. Statistically, that is almost impossible unless the underlying event was common, which means that where these populations overlapped, they were not two isolated species glancing at each other across a boundary. They were meeting, repeatedly, forming families. The boundary we imagine between human species, clean, biological, absolute, was in reality porous, and people crossed it all the time. Denisova Cave, as it turns out, is the only site on Earth where all three groups have left traces, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans, occupying the same shelter at different points across tens of thousands of years. But the genome raised a much harder question than it answered, and for over a decade, it went unresolved. If this population existed for hundreds of thousands of years, where are they? Where are the bones? The physical evidence was almost comically thin: a fingertip, a few teeth, a couple of bone fragments. Nothing that could tell you height, build, face, or posture. A ghost species. The search for them ended up going in a direction nobody expected. Not deeper into Siberia, but south and east, into places where Denisovans supposedly had no business being. In 1980, a Buddhist monk in Gansu province, China, found a heavy fragment of a lower jaw in Baixia Karst cave on the Tibetan Plateau at over 3,000 meters of altitude. It sat unstudied for decades. In 2019, researchers analyzed the ancient proteins preserved in the bone, a technique that works where DNA has degraded completely, and identified it as Denisovan. It was at least 160,000 years old, which means Denisovans were living on the roof of the world, in thin air, in brutal cold, more than 100,000 years before our species managed permanent settlement there. Then a molar from a cave in Laos, in the subtropics. Then a jawbone dredged up by fishermen from the seafloor off Taiwan, confirmed as Denisovan in 2025. The map exploded outward: Siberia, the Tibetan Plateau, southern China, mainland Southeast Asia, and, judging by the genetics of living people, very probably out across the islands beyond it. This is the part that separates them from the Neanderthals in a way that deserves more attention than it gets. Neanderthals were broadly cold climate specialists in a defined region. The Denisovans occupied Arctic-grade Siberian winters, high-altitude plateau, and humid tropical forests. That is not a species clinging to a niche. That is a population of generalists who solved half a hemisphere, and still, no face. That changed in June 2025. In 1933, a laborer working on a bridge over the Songhua River in Harbin, northeast China, found a massive human skull. China was under Japanese occupation. Rather than surrender it, he hid it, reportedly down a well, where it stayed for the better part of a century. It only reached scientists in 2018. In 2021, researchers described it as an entirely new species and named it Homo longi, Dragon Man. It was unlike anything in the modern human range: huge, long, and low-vaulted, with a heavy brow ridge, nearly square eye sockets, a wide mouth, and oversized teeth, but with a brain case volume of around 1,420 milliliters, fully within the range of ours. Then two teams did something remarkable. They recovered over 20,000 protein fragments from the bone and, in a genuinely new technique, extracted mitochondrial DNA from the hardened dental plaque still stuck to its teeth. Both lines of evidence pointed the same way. The Harbin skull is Denisovan, at least 146,000 years old, and closely tied to the early Denisovan lineage from Siberia. After 15 years of a species defined entirely by its genome, we finally have a face to attach to it. And by extension, a set of criteria for going back through the museum collections of East Asia and re-examining every strange, unclassifiable skull sitting in a drawer somewhere with a question mark on the label. Which brings us to the last part of this, and the part that should genuinely change how you think about your own body. Denisovans did not simply die out. They were absorbed. When modern humans expanded east out of Africa, they met these people and had children with them. More than once in more than one place. The evidence is not inferred from bones. It is sitting in living genomes today. People across Melanesia and New Guinea carry roughly 4% Denisovan DNA, and the highest concentration found anywhere in the world belongs to the Ita Magbukan of the Philippines, who carry something on the order of 5%, around 30 to 40% more Denisovan ancestry than Papuans or Aboriginal Australians, pointing to a completely separate interbreeding event on the islands of Southeast Asia. And some of that inherited DNA is not passive baggage, it is load-bearing. The clearest case is a gene called EPase-1, which governs how the body responds to low oxygen. Tibetans carry a version of it that allows them to live at extreme altitude without the thickened, dangerous blood that kills lowlanders who stay too long. That version did not evolve in our lineage. It came from Denisovans, A population that had already been solving the altitude problem on that plateau for over 100,000 years before we got there. They handed us the answer, and it is still in use today. Other fragments of their genome show up in immune function, in metabolism, in traits that vary across populations for reasons we are only beginning to trace. So when we say a human species went extinct, we should be careful with the word. The Denisovans stopped existing as a distinct people, but their genetic contribution was folded into ours and carried forward for 50,000 years, and it is being expressed, right now, in cells belonging to people who have never heard the name. Here is what I want you to take from this. The world you live in, one species of human, alone, unaccompanied, has existed for maybe the last 40,000 years. Before that, for the overwhelming majority of the time there have been humans at all, there was company. There were other minds shaped by other evolutionary paths, other ways of solving cold and altitude and hunger, and where we met them, we did not treat them as a separate order of being. We had children with them. Our loneliness as a species is not the natural state. It is the exception, and it is new. And we only discovered the Denisovans in 2008, from a fingertip, in a cave nobody had finished looking through. Which raises the obvious question, and it is not a rhetorical one. What else was out there, walking beside us, that has not left a fragment small enough, or lucky enough, for us to have found yet?